This particular psalm that I read for you today has a story behind it. This is not just one in which David sat down and decided to compose a psalm just to dedicate to God. There was a reason that he did this particular, or wrote this particular psalm. And for us to understand and to get something from this, I think we need to go back actually to 1 Samuel in the Old Testament, chapters 21 and 22. Just a quick recap as to what's taking place, and you'll kind of get an idea of where we're going with this. Saul, who was king of Israel at that time, has grown weary of David. He's very jealous of David, and he feels threatened by David. For too long, Saul has heard the people say, as he would ride into a city, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000. And now David is a threat. And he's on the run because Saul wants to kill him. Now the story we will look at today is when David goes into a city called Nob. He's on the run. And he's looking for other people to help him as best he can, but he doesn't want the people in Nob to realize that he's being pursued. It could be detrimental for them. So he goes to the priest there in Nob, and he asks for food, and they give him bread, and he asks for a weapon, and they give him the sword that he used to sever Goliath's head. And he leaves. And they offer him a word from God, unbeknownst to them that David is on the run. But there's a man in that town by the name of Doeg. Doeg is one of those kind of people that is a conniving political climber. He's considered Saul's chief shepherd, but he's power hungry. And he'll do anything to gain power and position. So he goes to Saul and tells him that David has been in the city of Nob, and I know you're looking for him, and the priests of Nob have aided him. So Saul calls the priest in. And he asked them, did you not see David? They said, yes, we did. He said, did you feed him? He said, yes, of course we did. We always feed him when he comes to our town. He said, then you gave him a weapon. He said, yes, we gave him the sword that he killed Goliath with. And on that, Saul ordered that the priest be killed. And he told his soldiers to do so, but they refused to do it. So he turns to Doeg. And he says, you do it. And he does. He kills every one of those priests. But on top of that, he goes to Nob and kills every man, woman, and child in the city. It's a horrible crime. People are devastated. And what's worse, they feel helpless. There's nothing they can do. Doeg is even boasting about his deed. And no one can do anything because he's under the protection of the powerful King Saul. And people feel helpless. David felt helpless. And because of it, no one dared to confront Saul or Doeg. No one but David. If he does so, is what we call the 52nd Psalm. He confronts Doeg in this psalm. But what I want you to understand about this psalm today is this is not just a psalm of confrontation. It runs much deeper than that. It runs really to the very depth of trust on the part of David. It's an incredible trust that David has in God. He begins this psalm like anybody would, devastated as to what's happening, has questions. And he doesn't understand how Doeg could do this. Why do you boast believing you mighty hero? Why do you boast all day long, you who are a disgrace in the eyes of God? How did this happen? Why would you do such a thing? How could you have done such a thing? And you know, sometimes we're like that in our lives, aren't we? Somebody or something will happen to us that stuns us, and we feel wrong for what's happening. We feel helpless to do anything about it. And we have questions, how could this happen? What did we do to have this take place? What do we do about it? We feel helpless sometimes. And too often we feel powerless. And I think sometimes when we do feel powerless, sometimes we feel as though God is not seeing us. He doesn't hear us. Perhaps God is not interested in our plight, we might think. Powerless people sometimes in their helplessness think some really crazy things, don't they? God doesn't care. Look at this situation. Or maybe they think that God can't see their hurt and their anger maybe, their resentment and the injustice that they're having to deal with. Sometimes in our helplessness we feel that way. That's not really the case with David in this psalm. David relies on his knowledge of God's character as judge of evil and defender of the weak. David is not wringing his hands and wanting to know what's going to happen. How is this all going to work out? David is not questioning God as to how he could let something like this happen. That's not what he does in this psalm. He relies on the character of God because he knows God. And he says, surely God will bring down to everlasting ruin. Bring you down to everlasting ruin. He will snatch you up and pluck you from your pit. He will uproot you from the land of the living. Now, at the onset, that sounds like he's telling God what to do, but he's not. It comes across as though he's asking for revenge, but that's not what David is doing here. You see, David is placing his trust in God. In other words, he's saying God will act. And we say, when? And David says, I don't know. And we say, how? How will it happen? And David says, I don't know. All I know is God will act in his own time, at his own pleasure. But the important point that I want you to understand is David believes that. David believes that. Even in his situation, even in his peril, he relies on God. His life is in peril. His powers are greater than him or in pursuit of him. Now, how helpless can you be? And yet, I want you to hear this again. I want you to hear this particular verse, verse 8, that David proclaims his trust in God. This is a powerful statement on his part. And he says, but I am like an olive tree, flourishing in the house of God. I trust in God's unfailing love forever. Ever. It's an incredible trust. Tim Hansel is the author of a book called Holy Sweat. And he tells us a story about the time that he and his young son Zach were out in a park area, and they were climbing a cliff off to the side of the park there. Zach was a little bit ahead of him, and they were climbing, and Tim was busy making sure he held on to the right things to climb up behind Zach. And all of a sudden he hears Zach holler, Dad, catch me! And as he looks up, here comes Zach in full flight. Tim says that he panicked for a moment, tried to get his feet straight so he could catch Zach as he fell, and he caught him and he fell over the ground. After catching his breath, Tim gets up, dusts himself off, and he says, Zach, can you give me one good reason why you did that? And Zach looks at his father and says, in a very calm voice, sure, you're my dad. He didn't ask permission to jump. He trusted his father to catch him? Sure. You're my dad. You're my dad. You see, Zach's whole assurance that his dad would catch him was based on the fact that his father was indeed trustworthy. And he knew that. He wasn't testing his father to find out. It was an accepted point of his life. My dad can be trusted. Watch. Catch me. Catch me. Zach could live his life in complete confidence that his father could be trusted. I'll give you an example a little bit closer to home. When you came in today, and we visited for a few moments, and you sat in the pew, you trusted that the pew was going to hold you. You never thought twice about it. God wants that kind of trust in you. That's what he looks for. See, we too should live our lives in confidence that God can be trusted. No matter what happens in your life, no matter the peril, no matter how helpless, God will act. God will act. In this psalm, it's an interesting point too, that David refers to himself as an olive tree. I don't know much about trees. I really don't. I'm a city boy. I was raised around bicycles, parking lots, and school campgrounds and so forth, playgrounds. So I don't know a lot about trees. I can probably tell you where a pine tree is and point out an oak tree from time to time, but that's it. So I did a little investigating. Why would David even say that he is an olive tree? There has to be some significance to that. And what I found out really was this, that like that olive tree, the olive tree itself rather, can live for 100 years. They have the capability of doing that. I think that's pretty interesting. And then also looking, I found that it has the ability to survive in drought and searing heat and still produce fruit. And do you know why? Because the olive tree roots run very, very deep into the ground. David says, I'm like an olive tree because his trust in God runs deep. Very, very deep. And like that olive tree, David is nourished just in the simple fact of knowing that God would not fail him. Even under the incredible situation that he was in. God would not fail him. He could be trusted. An interesting point about this psalm is this. David does not even speak to God until the last verse. All of it has been directed towards joy and how David feels about the situation. And it's in the very last verse that David says, for what you have done, I will always praise you in the presence of your faithful people. And I will hope in your name, for your name is good. There's no doubt for David. God will act. God is good. I got to this point of preparing the sermon, and sometimes conclusions are hard to come by. They're not as hard as getting started sometimes as knowing when to cut things off. So I looked up something, trying to find some place for a conclusion, and I ran across this just by accident. It's a poem by an unknown writer, and I think it pretty much sums up what we talked about today. It's short, and I would like to read that to you if I could. Trust him when dark times assail thee. Trust him when thy strength is small. Trust him when to simply trust him seems the hardest thing of all. Trust him. He is ever faithful. Trust him, for his Trust him. For the heart of Jesus is the only place to go. Brothers and sisters, in all your trials, in the times of being helpless, I urge you, trust